And I think it's now my happy occasion to then turn our proceedings to to a panel discussion, which I'm going to be moderating. And the four panelists we've chosen are absolutely stellar. All of them will have a great deal of add to our knowledge of this. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each of them. I'm going to be introducing them. I'll introduce them now in the order in which they're going to speak. And they are going to be able to fill in much and provide much more detail to the application of international law. So the first person I'm going to be asking in a minute to speak is Mr. Issam Younis, who is the director of the Al Mizan Center for Human Rights in Gaza. He is the Commissioner General of the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights, and he is also the president of the Arab Network for National Human Rights Institutions. And I have dealt with Issam on many occasions and find him to simply be a stellar advocate for human rights. The second person to speak will be Hagit Ofran, who is the director of Settlement Watch Project attached to the Israeli Peace Now movement. And Hagit is the director, and she's widely recognized as Israel's foremost expert on West Bank and East Jerusalem settlements, and she's responsible for monitoring, scrutinizing, and analyzing Israeli construction and planning of settlements in the West Bank. Our third panelist today will be Ms. Sahar Francis, who has been since 2006 the Director General of the Ramallah-based Adamir Prison Support and Human Rights Association, which is a Palestinian NGO providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. And fourth, we're going to be joined by Nadwa Kiswanson, who is a Swedish Palestinian, should I also say Dutch lawyer as well, who specializes in international criminal and human rights law. And she has represented Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq and its partners for the past decade at various institutions, such as at the United Nations, the European Union, as well as at the International Criminal Court. And I believe she's based in The Hague. All four of these people have a very rich history of human rights advocacy, and I'm sure the panel coming up is going to be simply top drawer. You each have roughly 12 minutes, and if I'm going to ask all the rest of us to close our video and just have only the person on who's speaking to be on the video. If I appear on the screen, the speaker will know that your time is getting nigh. So Issam, can I ask you to start us off and show us, and please talk to us about the issues with respect to Gaza.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lynk. And let me first apologize in advance for any inconvenience and stable connections that from my side due to the cuts of electricity now in the area where I live. It's almost 14 hours of cuts of electricity. So I'll do my best to manage with that. Well, let me begin by thanking the Balfour Project for organizing this important conference. I especially want to commend the organizers for their choice of the theme of this conference, measuring the distance between international law and the lived reality in the occupied Palestinian territory. It would not be hyperbolic to say the distance is astronomical. Allow me to illustrate. I mean, for those who don't know Gaza, Gaza is very tiny slide alongside the Mediterranean, 360 square kilometers, with inhabitants of 2.2 million. 75% are refugees. 85% of the families are dependent on humanitarian aid provided by different aid agencies in Gaza. And Gaza, as you know, for the last 15 consecutive years under blockade. And before I start my presentation, the blockade is not only a collective punishment that's outlawed under international law. There is a process of de-development, as if you're taking Gaza and throw it backward 60 or 70 years, and by doing so, the Israeli occupation forces sieging the future of a whole nation. And what exactly, I mean, this is very inherent in the doctrine and the strategy that the Israeli government has worked on to transfer Palestinians from a nation to communities. That's why the siege is imposed over Gaza, to isolate Gaza from the rest of the occupied territories, and Gaza to live its own problems under the blockade: electricity, sewage system, access, and this stuff. And the same thing in Jerusalem with the taxes that are heavily imposed. There are no taxes, and the very discriminatory laws and building licenses, etc. The south of the West Bank, settlements and this stuff. The same thing also in the north of the West Bank. So this is just the blockade in a nutshell, and we could elaborate more to show how they have controlled the geography and the demography, the fragmentation that they tried their best to do it in the last 11 days has been proven to be a complete failure, and Palestinians have reunited in all levels on the two sides of the green line. So it's complete failure. It's very anthropological, very colonialist, very discriminatory, and it did not last and will not last. Palestinians are a nation, have rights, and by the way, our main struggle, our main cause is not a state. It's not acceptable to summarize and just to link Palestinians only with the state. I mean, Palestinians have rights, and the whole struggle should be a rights-based approach. Right to self-determination, and by default, the state will come, and then the right to return. Israel perpetrates violence in Gaza on a daily basis. You probably hear about the violence only when it escalates, namely in the full-scale offensive in 2008-9 and 2012, 2014, and the latest in May, or also during the Great March of Return protests. What the international media deprives you from hearing about is the stories of that violence, people's lives, who they were, what those who passed away meant to their families. During one of the long nights of Israel's offensive in Gaza in 2014, Israeli air forces launched 9 missiles at a house in Rafah city. At the time of the attack, my 75-year-old father, my 53-year-old stepmother, my brothers and their wives and children were sleeping in our family home right next to the one that was targeted. The 9 missiles obliterated the targeted house and damaged my family home, killing my father, stepmother, and my 4-year-old niece. My sisters-in-law and their children were all injured in the attack. The local media reported on the murder. The international media only reported the increase in the death toll in Gaza. Human rights organizations like my own documented the attack on the densely populated neighbor as one potentially violating international humanitarian law and the rights of the victims and survivors. But the survivors who have not seen justice. No soldier, commander, or government leader was held accountable for this potential war crime. There was no independent investigation, let alone prosecution. But even these terms sound stale and strange compared to what the experience meant to me. The key word in the occupied territories is accountability. Accountability is being intentionally thrown away, deleted from the order of the day. And as long as the Israeli troops, Israeli army is not accountable, we have warned and we still warning that the worst is yet to come. During Israel offensive in 2014, over 2,000 Palestinians were killed throughout the course of those hostilities. 1,066 people, including 370 children, were killed inside their homes. In similar situations to mine, over 10,200 were wounded. More than 100,000 Palestinians were made homeless. Even these large figures did not trigger action by the international community to activate accountability mechanisms. I must note that this failure to enforce international law was only a repetition of the failure to do so after Israel's area offensive in 2009, 2008, 2009, and 2012. Will this failure persist? Yet again now, after Israel's latest offensive, a few days ago. Between the 10th and 21st of May in Gaza, the Israeli military killed 253 Palestinians, including 66 children, many of them in their homes while they slept without warning. All over Gaza for 12 days, entire families were huddled in hallways and living in kitchen floors because those seemed like the safest places, but nowhere is safe in Gaza. Usually in times of danger, people leave their homes and go for shelters or bunkers. There's no syringes in Gaza. So people, when in times of when 150 war jets occupied the sky of Gaza, people just grabbed their homes, gathered in the kitchens, and then, as if the safest place in the building. So the kitchen together with the building, in many cases have been attacked. The Israeli military destroyed 1,800 homes and damaged upwards of 14,000 more. 23 hospitals and medical centers were completely or partially destroyed. The only sewage plant was made inoperable. The 12-story tower that housed Al Jazeera and the Associated Press was brought to the ground, which meant that getting information out was made never more difficult. Nearly 60,000 people were made homeless, many still living in appalling humanitarian conditions in makeshift shelters. Israel's unlawful closure, a 14-year collective punishment, was heightened. Its devastating impacts on social, economic, cultural, and environmental rights for 2 million people in Gaza. The offensive ends and Israel continues its daily forms of violence. These forms are even less visible to the outside world. They are the stories of the slow, grinding violations of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights that make life so much harder than it has to be. In 2016, I was diagnosed with rectal cancer. Due to the Israeli government's closure and blockade policy, which restricts the entry of medicines, medical equipment, and healthcare expertise, as well as Israeli attacks on healthcare facilities. You know, the blockade, again, is not only a collective punishment. There is a process of de-development. De-development is quite clear on the different aspects of the life of the Gazans. Gaza's healthcare sector has been de-developed to a stage where healthcare for cancer and critically ill patients is unavailable in Gaza. My only option was to leave Gaza to get the urgent treatment I needed. Now, to leave Gaza, I need an Israeli exit permit, through which Israel subjected me to a deliberate process of delay. As you may well know, when it comes to cancer and critical illnesses, each single day of delay counts against not only the chances of survival, but also the hope for it. Besides the physical pain, I suffered from extreme stress, as did my family and close ones along with me. Through this delay, I had to reschedule my appointment at Augusta Victoria Hospital and Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem before Israel issued me the permit. But even in doing so, Israel denied the chance to have all my family with me. They allowed only my wife. I was denied the family support and any patient, especially cancer patients, need. But this is not the story of only. In 2020, Israeli either rejected or delayed 31% of permit applications to leave Gaza for urgent medical treatment, a relatively high success rate compared to previous years. But still, 5 patients, include 1 woman and 2 children, died after their hospital care was delayed. Their stories likely went unreported, and the psychological violence that their families endured as well. Even worse, there is again no accountability despite the chronic occurrence of these events, despite the norms that are broken under international law, despite our careful advocacy at the international level, in particular with European government. However compelling these stories may be, the conditions get worse, not better, and the international community proceeded with its status quo of remarks of concern, but no concrete actions. And Israel's sense of impunity deepens every time the international community fails to hold it to account. The clearest example is the last offensive earlier this month. By the way, in the year 2012, just to go in depth into what is what does it mean, the blockade that's imposed over Gaza? In the year 2000, in the year 2012, Haaretz newspaper published a summary of what the so-called Red Line document that was disclosed by the Israeli coordinator of government activities in the Palestinian territories. This document, which was released in 2008, included a calculation of the minimum number of needed calories per person without reaching under nutrition as a result of the siege. In this context, there was the calculation of the minimum number of needed calories of basic foodstuff for every respective age segment that were allowed to be entered into Gaza Strip, as well as specifying the number of needed trucks for transporting the minimum quantities. The calculation was 2,279 calories per person per day, which includes 1,836 grams of foodstuffs, which means equivalent to 25,755 tons for all the residents of the Gaza Strip. This means that it's only allowed to enter a certain number of trucks carrying the specified quantities of basic foodstuffs for Gaza's residents as based on the calculation. This is the biopolitics. On May 16, during the offensive in Gaza, my family and I were putting plates on the table for lunch. The food was still hot and we were about to take our seats when we were informed that we must evacuate our home and leave the neighborhood. Israeli jet fighters were about to bombard a nearby building. My wife, children, and I had our important documents in small bags. We rushed to them and left our homes, our house for relatives. My neighbors did the same, but even my relative's house was not considered safe. We were told again to evacuate. And this time, my family and I went to a Shifa hospital as if it's the safest place in Gaza, because we thought it was the latest unsafe place to go. During my temporary displacement through this, I was on the phone with a news channel. And I said, the world is now treating international law as toilet papers. I said that as a statement of support of Israel's right to self-defense were being sent from many concerns of Europe and elsewhere. I must reiterate that the offensive is only one case of Israel's undeterred, protracted violations of international law. My organization, Al Mizan Center for Human Rights, has been documenting these violations since the organization established in the year 1999. Through the 2 decades, as had been the case before, we saw Israel continue to expand the distance between international law and lived realities for the population. I know that I ran out of time. Let me say, just to end with the with this. Let me say this. It was in the UK at Essex University where I obtained my qualification in human rights. I was among the first and few Palestinians to gain such a qualification. My study there was funded by the British government, by your tax money, so that I could help improve the situation of human rights in Palestine. If the UK continues its inaction regarding Israel's violations of human rights, it's contradicting its own goals of supporting any study, wasting your tax money, sabotaging my and other human rights activists' work, and even worse, becoming complicit in the suffering of Palestinians. So I call on you, the citizens, to challenge that, use your voter power, freedom of speech right, and conscious sense of human dignity and solidarity to help this decades-long injustice. Thank you so much.
Issam, thank you so much. You packed a lot into the 12 minutes. I'm now going to turn to Hagit Ofran, and the same thing will apply. When you see my face, that's a signal that the time is nigh.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to talk a little bit about settlements. As you all know, and as Michael explained, this is one of the biggest violations of the international law by Israel. but it's also another way of oppression and taking over Palestinian lands and preventing the possibility for future resolution of our conflict and future two-state solution. So this is why the issue of settlements is very, very important. And I would like to talk about trends that are ongoing right now. And for that, I would like to share with you a few slides. In addition to continuous construction of settlements all the time, I think what we are seeing today is a revolution in terms of the infrastructure and the roads. And I want to, I put this map of the West Bank, and you can see the main road, the old road that goes from south to north, going through the main cities. This was the road that also settlers used to take at the beginning of the occupation. But then came the Oslo Agreement, and Israel withdrew from 40% of the West Bank, or at least was supposed to withdraw. And the main roads that also were used by settlers were now in the Palestinian Authority territory. And the government of Rabin, that was supposed to go to peace, and we had an interim agreement that was supposed to end in a final status agreement by May 99, for this interim time decided to build bypass roads so that settlers will be able to bypass Bethlehem, or to bypass Hebron, or to bypass Ramallah or Nablus. And it was billions of shekels that Israel did. But what it enabled was the development of the settlements. Because you can imagine that if settlers who live in settlements south of Jerusalem, in the Gush Etzion area, if they are traveling every day, commuting to Israel through Bethlehem, so it's traffic jams, but it's also the sense of fear to be in a Palestinian town. So now they have a highway that bypasses all those problems. And with that infrastructure, they managed to bring the settlers today in the West Bank to be almost 500,000 or 460,000 settlers, in addition to the East Jerusalem settlers. What we see that these roads are already packed. And in order to develop the settlements more, they need to put more into infrastructure. And that's what the government of Israel has been doing in the last few years. And it was under the radar, and not too many people know about it, that Israel put billions of shekels to build new roads. And that's a map that only puts on one map some of those roads that are could be revolutionary in terms of the development of settlements. I'm talking about the doubling of the tunnels road, bypassing Bethlehem. I'm talking about Kalandia underpass, which is another route for settlers to drive into Israel without going through the traffic jams of Jerusalem, etc., etc. And I think it's something that we overlooked for many years. I want also to focus on one of the roads that is now being promoted, and I hope we will be able to stop it, that the government is saying that it's planned for the Palestinians, and it's a road between Al-Azariya and Azaraim. This is a map of the center of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Ma'ale Adumim settlement in the end. And when today, all Palestinian traffic in the West Bank, if they want to drive from Bethlehem to Ramallah, they need to bypass East Jerusalem from the east. And the road goes to Al-Azariya, and then they need to turn east near Ma'ale Adumim, and then climb up to Ramallah. Now, what the government of Israel is planning is to make a shortcut that will allow them to go on this road in black, to go and bypass it without the need to go through Ma'ale Adumim. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that the planned road will, as soon as it is going to be built, the old road for Palestinians will be blocked. And all this red area east of East Jerusalem is going to be closed for Palestinian movement. And this is around 2% of the West Bank that Israel is planning to close down for Palestinians. And the checkpoint today for settlers in Ma'ale Adumim will be removed. They will be free to go in and out. And Israel will be able to claim that the Palestinians have their own transportational continuity rather than territorial continuity, and to build in the heart of the West Bank another settlement like E1. So that's a very dangerous development that I think we should all look into. Another very important development of recent years is those new farm settlements, agriculture farms, with very little investment, with very few people. The settlers are taking over a huge amount of land. They established 40 of them already in the last few years, and they control a huge amount of land. They go out with their sheep, and whatever Palestinian wants to go close, they will kick them out, threaten them out, or call the army to do it. And this way, they took over a lot of land. So it's another very problematic development that is going on. I wanted also to take advantage of the time that I have in order to speak about things that are happening now in Jerusalem. And I think it is connected to many of the things that Michael Lynk talked about. This is a map of the old city area, and you can see all the brown areas are the Palestinian neighborhoods around the old city, and the red dots are settlements that Israeli settlers managed to take. It's houses that they build, or actually they managed to take over Palestinian houses and bring in settlers instead, in many, many ways. And as you all heard in recent weeks, in Sheikh Jarrah, we have a huge settlement coming up, and in Batan el-Hawa, in the same story. And I want us to understand a little bit what is at stake and what is happening and how it works, or how it looks like. This is a settlement in the heart of the Palestinian neighborhood. It's one house with a flag and guards on top of it, and whenever a settler child goes to school, he is escorted by guards that are funded by the Israeli taxpayer. This picture was taken in Batan el-Hawa in Silwan, south of the old city. This is the widest street in Batan el-Hawa. All the people you see in the picture are under current immediate threat of being evicted. All of them have court cases ongoing with pile of papers that settlers are suing them out. This is a picture of Batan el-Hawa. Almost all of the houses you see are under threat. The settlers managed to take these 3 homes, and others are pending. This is about 700 people. Here, the Sheikh Jarrah, you can see all the blue houses that are already taken by settlers, and the reds are ones that are in courts pending, waiting for to the final decision of the court. Here is how it looks like today, the Sheikh Jarrah area, and the settlers, what they want to do is to take over all this area, knock down the houses as soon as they complete the eviction or the displacement of the Palestinians here, and to build 300 units for settlers. I think it's the first time that Israel is going to have a mass displacement of Palestinians since '67. We took a lot of land of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. 1/3 of the land was confiscated for public use, and then was settlements were built on it. But we never took the land and kick out the Palestinians from their house in order to build our settlements. And now we are having, not in large scale, we had a house here and there. Now we're talking about 200 or 300 people in Sheikh Jarrah and 700 people in Silwan. And what is the basis of that? Is the discriminatory law. And for that we need to go in 2 minutes back to 48. As you know, in 1948 there was a war here. All the red dots that you see in this map are Palestinian villages and towns that were left behind. The Palestinians were forced out, and Israel decided by law that we will make use of all these properties for the benefit of Israel, and the land was confiscated and they cannot return or take back their properties. In Jerusalem, the same. We had Palestinian neighborhoods that were evicted. About 35,000 Palestinians were kicked out, and a very small community of Jews in Sheikh Jarrah and in the old city, around 2,000 Jews also lost their properties in that war, and they all got alternative housing in West Jerusalem and citizenship in Israel, while the Palestinians went nowhere and or had no place to go and became refugees. Israel annexed the East Jerusalem and made it officially part of Israel in 1967, and decided a few years later to legislate a law that says that Jews can return to the houses that they lost in 48. So this is what the settlers are doing. They managed to take possession of the original owners from before 48, and then to sue the Palestinians out based on the ownership for before 48, while Palestinians, of course, cannot do that in West Jerusalem or in Israel at large. So we see the discrimination very, very clearly, and we can start to understand why this eruption of violence started now in such a strong manner. Also, I wanted also to say it is not a legal matter, although the government is saying that it's a legal matter between two sides that are fighting over ownership. It's a political matter that is done through legal means, and the legal means are discriminatory, and the government can stop it. And I would like to give you the two ways the government can stop it. Right now, the court asked the government or the Attorney General to give his opinion in the issue of those cases of eviction in Sheikh Jarrah and Batan el-Hawa, and the government is now supposed to give its answer. And if the government is going to say it's fine to evict or to displace hundreds of people and replace them with settlers, then it is official policy of the Israeli government. But if they take another stand, the court will surely agree to prevent the eviction. And another way is to confiscate the land from the settlers. If we were able to confiscate 23,000 dunams from Palestinians and give it to settlers or to Israelis, we can confiscate 25 dunams from settlers and give it to Palestinians. And I think the whole discourse of rights by the international law is very relevant to ensure or secure the rights of housing of those Palestinians who were living there for decades, and in good faith they went into those houses. They never stole, they are not squatters, and they're supposed to be allowed to stay in their homes, while the original owners that the settlers managed to take over, they can be compensated. Michael, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I was muted. I was just looking at the chat box to look at all of the superlatives that are coming in for your presentation on the maps. So well done. I'll now turn it over to Sahar. All yours.
Hello, and allow me first to thank the organizers for such an interesting panel, and to thank you, Professor Lynk, for the legal introduction, because honestly, this is the theory that really our discussions and interventions would fit into perfectly in how to really give the picture of how Israel as a state were manipulating and using international law and all legal means in order to oppress more, to keep the control over the Palestinians for decades and decades. And like it's very short time in order to brief about the subject of the Palestinian children under the military system and in general the imprisonment and how actually the Israeli occupation were using imprisonment in order to keep this control and oppression against Palestinians in a illegal way, and how they justified all the practices like torture and other grave violations against prisoners and detainees and in the name of the law and by a legal system, the military system, of course, that was immediately implemented after the occupation. So just to summarize what was going on lately in the last month and a half, actually since the 13th of April, when all the demonstrations and the clashes started in the middle of Ramadan, inside East Jerusalem and then in Sheikh Jarrah, and then spread to inside Israel, to the West Bank, and of course in the time of the war against Gaza. In this period, Israel arrested more than 2,650 Palestinians. In East Jerusalem alone, it was around 550 Palestinians. Of course, all these figures including children. There's no specific, till now, we don't have a very accurate statistics about how many of those were just children. And inside 48, just in the last 2 days, there were an intensive campaign of mass arrests that 250 people were arrested for so far in the last 2 days. And of course, there's a decision by the state to submit charges against all these detainees based on the claim that they were attacking police or violent in the demonstrations, and all charges are covered with the ideological argument that it was motivated by racist and ideological means, where we can find that even in this mass arrest, there is a discrimination, because we all saw how Israeli Jewish extremists, sometimes settlers who were coming to the inside Israel in the cities like Haifa, Lid, Ramli, and other cities, and also attacking Palestinians. The level of arrest within the Israelis is not, Israeli Jews, of course, is not in the same level. In these mass arrests, there's lots of violence, there's lots of attacks, and we are documenting tens of cases where people are injured while being arrested because the police would use lots of violence. In some cases, people were hospitalized because of these injuries, and including children that later, like they were, most of the children who were arrested and brutally attacked in these campaigns were released after a couple of hours or within a couple of days without being charged, but of course under conditions to be under house arrest sometimes, or paying a bill, very high bills. Currently, there is, and of course in this period, the level of administrative detention, arresting, and this is of course a British heritage, the use of administrative detention. There was a significant increase in issuing administrative detention orders in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, there were 4 cases in East Jerusalem, because usually they don't use administrative detention very often in East Jerusalem, but this round 4 people were sent for administrative detention. In the West Bank, 84 people were arrested under administrative detention, including actually 2 children. So currently there's 4 children held under administrative detention. Later I would explain more about the policy of administrative detention against children, and specifically mentioning the case of Amal Nakhli, the Palestinian boy whose detention was even extended for the 2nd time under administrative detention. Currently, in total, there's around 160 minors, Palestinian juveniles, arrested in the Israeli prisons. Of course, all of them are held in prisons inside Israel. The only prison that is located physically in the West Bank is Ofer, but Israel treats it as part of Jerusalem area, so they impose on the families to get security permits in order to be enabled to reach Ofer. This is by itself transferring the detainees into the state is a violation for the international law. But if we review all the policies and the laws that these boys, these children would be subjected to, it's either the civil system inside that is like applicable in East Jerusalem for those who lives in Jerusalem, or the military system that applies on the West Bank. I will not cover what's going on in 48 areas. Maybe we can leave it for the Q&A, but in order to highlight the discriminatory practices, even in the system itself, of course, there's a huge difference in between the military courts and the civil courts. And it should be highlighted that Israel so far up till 2012 actually were not implementing any protections for Palestinian children in the military justice system. Even defining a child up to that year was 16 years old and not 18 years old. Although in 2010 they invented the military courts for juveniles, but this court definitely is not respecting all the measures that the international treaty, the Convention for the Protection of the Children, is talking about. So lots of rights actually is not respected and violates the international standards of a fair trial. Juveniles could be interrogated in Arabic, but in some cases the testimony, the confession is written in Hebrew, or even if it's written in Arabic, there's no obligation when it's considered a security case to like photograph the interrogation sessions, which means we don't know what's going on in the interrogation with these juveniles in real time, while according to the Israeli law, the criminal code, it's a must that you cannot interrogate a child overnight. You cannot interrogate a child without the presence of one of his parents. You have to take pictures and audio or video tape the interrogation and so on. And there was court decisions, even in security cases, against Jewish settlers' boys, those who were involved in the case of burning the Dawabshi family, that the court decided to cancel the confessions because of the use of torture. This has never happened in the case of Palestinian juveniles. Of course, the opposite, the Israeli military courts or the military governor, by changing the laws, or even inside Israel when they changed the Israeli criminal code in relation to some of the crimes in the case, because of the case of Ahmad Manasra, because Ahmad Manasra was arrested and charged with attempt of killing, and he was less than 14, and according to the Israeli law he wasn't supposed to be kept in detention till the end of the trial. So because of his case, the whole law was changed in order to give this opportunity that they can keep a Palestinian child in detention till the end of the trial. Later on he was convicted and sentenced for 12 years and a half. There's lots of examples from the legal system that we can bring to argue about this discrimination policy, but I would also give some attention to the real conditions of these children held under detention in the Israeli prisons. As I said, they all are inside the state of Israel, and in these 1 year and a half, even more, because of the spread of the COVID, of course, all these children were banned family visits because of the coronavirus spread, and especially even now when the situation in Israel is much better, families from the West Bank, because they didn't get the vaccine, they are not allowed to be entering to visit their children. And we had Palestinian and Israeli NGOs, we had to petition the Israeli High Court in order to guarantee a phone call for the Palestinian children to be able to call their families instead of the family visits. So once a month or in 2 weeks, the Palestinian children would get, because usually Palestinian prisoners are not allowed to get family visits, are not allowed to get phone calls while under detention in the Israeli prisons. So the exception was just made for the Palestinian juveniles. Of course, now all the juveniles in these days face lots of harassment, collective punishments when it comes for restrictions on their ability to go out for recreation, because there is claims, for example, that they were committing violations for the prison rules, the health conditions inside their cells, like in Damoun prison, for example. This prison is very old, and the building itself is not suitable for being a prison having children, and it was supposed to be shut down, but they use it as a prison. Of course, there's no special education, no special rehabilitation offered for these children. The imprisonment would be the most used sentence, and this is also a violation and this discriminatory policy if we compare it with the Israeli system, where rehabilitation and psychological social support would be the most common practice by the courts, and not the real custodial imprisonment. In the last couple of days, we reported, as I said, very severe attacks and harassment against some of the children, and 4 of the children, 3 actually in the last couple of weeks, were sent to administrative detention. But Amal Nakhli was actually the Palestinian boy from Ramallah, he's 17 years old, was arrested in the beginning of the year, in January actually, and he was sent for administrative detention. The uniqueness in the case of Amal, that Amal suffers from a very serious illness, and he's under a very serious threat. Amal has a problem in his myasthenia gravis, it's called, and this has caused his immune system to be very weak, and any effect by any virus could be a very serious threat to his life, especially after the COVID spread. And still, Amal was sent for, at the beginning, 6 months administrative detention, because they claimed they have secret information against him. We were expecting, after reducing the order to be 4 months, that he would be released. But unfortunately, his detention was extended for another 4 months. And Amal, in the same time, because he was arrested in November 2020, charged with throwing stones, and then we managed to release him because of health condition under bail till the end of the trial. So 2 months after, he was rearrested and sent for administrative detention. So currently he's under administrative detention, and in the same time he's facing a trial. I would end just by saying that the issue of the prisoners and all the associated practices on the level of torture and other violations that some of them definitely arbitrary detention, transfer amounts to war crimes. So beside the legal work that the international organizations or local Palestinian and Israeli organizations are doing, I think there is a chance, especially now after all what we were getting through in the last month, that we have to put more pressure, diplomatic pressure and public pressure on the state of Israel in order really to seek the accountability that we need in order to make them respect their responsibilities under international law and stop all these violations, definitely stopping the occupation. Like after hearing Professor Lynk and his analysis about this prolonged occupation, I don't think that we can allow that this occupation continues more. And definitely with what Hagit was describing about the land control and the current eviction of hundreds of Palestinians, this is another Nakba, and this is what caused all the latest demonstrations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar, very much for that. A great overview of a very tough topic to want to listen to. If I can now turn to Nada, it's all yours for the next 12 minutes, and again, you'll see me come up as your time is running short. Please take.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Balfour Project for organizing this important conference. I'm invited to present on accountability, and I will do so in my capacity as legal counsel for Palestinian victims before the International Criminal Court. I will focus in my presentation on the recent escalation of violence, guarantees of non-discrimination in the application of the law, and the UK's position on the situation in Palestine at the International Criminal Court. In recent weeks, people and governments from every corner of the world have witnessed the subjugation of Palestinians. It appears from the information available to us that the bombing of the locked-in Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip violated cardinal rules of the laws of armed conflict, such as the principles of precaution, proportionality, and distinction between civilians and combatants. Customary international law, which is binding on Israel and Palestinian armed groups, prohibits attacks that result in incidental loss of civilian life and damage to civilian objects where it is excessive to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Such concrete and direct military advantage has not been offered by Israel for its attacks on, for example, multi-story residential buildings, one of which housed international media offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. The bombing of the Gaza Strip was preceded by raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and the attempted forced eviction of refugee families from their homes in East Jerusalem. The attempted displacement of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, which coincided with Nakba Day, brought back painful memories of the mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948 and 1967. The escalation of violence that grabbed the world's attention in the recent weeks compelled many to revise the narrative of an even-handed conflict and a dispute over borders, a narrative that has been fed to people in Europe over several generations. It also reinvigorated calls for accountability. UN Special Rapporteur Lynk recently described accountability in a report to the United Nations as, quote, the institutional check on the exercise of public and private power on behalf of the common good, and an indispensable component of the rule of law. And as illuminated in that report, accountability encompasses countermeasures such as financial sanctions and arms embargoes. For the hundreds of Palestinians that I have had the privilege to represent in a recent proceeding before the International Criminal Court, the term accountability means just retribution, truth-telling, and reparation. For them, it is a matter of holding perpetrators criminally responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, crimes that the international community has agreed are heinous and therefore concern every state and must be punished. Palestinian victims are rightfully unapologetic in their call for justice. They seek what others take for granted, namely the non-discriminatory application of the law. If you were robbed of your belongings, kicked out of your home, and strangers took it over, your initial response would rightly be to contact the police and to see the culprit apprehended and tried, and for your home to be restored. If your siblings were murdered, you would not rest until the murderer was put behind bars. And if police tortured and detained your children, you would sue the state and demand a change of laws and overhaul of police procedures. The United Kingdom is a founding member of the International Criminal Court. It espouses human rights, justice, and the rule of law. But these commitments ring hollow when applied selectively. And the United Kingdom's stance on the ICC investigation in Palestine shows that the United Kingdom makes an exception for Palestinians. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is an independent and objective authority mandated by states, including the United Kingdom, through the Rome Statute to, quote, establish the truth, end quote. The prosecutor concluded in 2019 that there exists a reasonable basis to believe that Rome Statute crimes have been committed on the occupied Palestinian territory. And the prosecutor pointed to acts and conduct of the Israeli army, the State of Israel, and Palestinian armed groups. We have just had the privilege to hear from the ground accounts of such acts, including the unlawful transfer of settlers, land appropriation, and willful killing. And in February of this year, ICC judges confirmed that the court may exercise jurisdiction over crimes committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. In response to this decision, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote in a letter in April that the United Kingdom aims to bring positive change to the court and referred in this context to the appointment of 2 British nationals to the positions of ICC judge and ICC prosecutor, and said that their appointment will, I quote, help serve reform, end quote. The letter does not explain what positive change the UK seeks, nor the meaning of reform that its UK nationals will contribute to. But the Prime Minister's statements were followed with a declaration that the United Kingdom opposed the ICC investigation into war crimes in Palestine, and that this investigation gives the impression of being a partial and prejudicial attack on a friend and ally of the UK. The letter by Boris Johnson on behalf of the UK government is cause for serious concern. It suggests that the United Kingdom doesn't respect the principles of prosecutorial and judicial independence. It exposes the UK's discriminatory approach to the law when it comes to Palestine, and it smells of exceptionalism. It gives no attention to the fact that the prosecutor and the pre-trial chamber have upheld the court's legal text and acted in accordance with its mandate, without fear or favor. It is incumbent on the prosecutor and judges under the Rome Statute to apply and interpret the law in accordance with human rights and without any adverse distinction on grounds such as gender, age, race, color, religion, national, ethnic, racial, social origin, or any other status. International humanitarian law, human rights law, the International Criminal Court, that recognize equal treatment under the law are conscious of the dangers of the discriminatory application of the law. It is a simple truth that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. If paths to justice are closed off, if we deprive Palestinians of the opportunity to seek judicial and peaceful resolution and remedy because of their identity and the identity of the perpetrator, then we're undermining the greater concept of justice and human rights. A selective approach to accountability in the context of the occupation of Palestine also bolsters an already existing situation of apartheid along racial and religious lines. Human Rights Watch new report on apartheid and persecution of Palestinians provides a meticulous legal analysis for those interested. Human Rights Watch conclude in their report that Israel, quote, methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and repress Palestinians, end quote. We must remember that Palestinians have already been denied remedy through the Israeli justice system. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination found in a decision last month that Israel's judicial system is, quote, illegitimate, futile, unavailable, ineffective, and insufficient, end quote. The Rome Statute provides a wide array of opportunities for both state parties and non-state parties to challenge decisions by the judges and the prosecutor. No one has challenged the latest decision on an investigation in Palestine. It is the strict obligation of the United Kingdom to respect the judicial dispute resolution mechanisms set out in the Rome Statute. And as a party to the Rome Statute, the United Kingdom has no choice but to cooperate with the court, even if it disagrees with it. In addition to respecting and cooperating with the International Criminal Court, the United Kingdom remains under a legal duty to actively pursue perpetrators of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and ensure that those grave breaches are brought to an end. When the ICC prosecutor confirmed the initiation of an investigation in the situation of Palestine this year, she stressed that our central concern must be to the victims, both Palestinians and Israelis. I cannot agree more. In making victims its central concern and by upholding the rule of law, the United Kingdom will protect and respect the dignity of the victims, as well as the dignity of the United Kingdom itself. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Nada, thank you very much for that. I'm going to call all four of the panelists back in. I have one or two questions I want to pose to all of you, and then I'm going to start going through the sum of the many, many questions that have been forwarded on to me, asked by our audience. And a lot of these questions are thoughtful, rich in both historical knowledge or legal knowledge, and I'll put them to you. But I'm wondering if I can use as a segue what Nada has just talked about. Nada's emphasis obviously has been on accountability or the lack of it. If you don't mind, I'm going to read something that I have in one of my most recent reports, and I'm then going to turn to you, for each of you, perhaps in the order in which you've spoken, to react to this with respect to international law and accountability. A year ago, I said, No occupation in the modern world has been conducted with the international community so alert to its many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupier's obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and establish permanent sovereignty, so well informed about the scale of suffering and dispossession endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it to use the tangible and plentiful legal and political tools at its disposal to end this injustice. How is it, if I can ask each of you, starting with Issam, how is it that we have an occupation? I don't think there's an occupation or conflict in the world where there's been so much legal attention and so much legal pronouncement on what is going on, yet so little follow through in terms of translating those declarations and proclamations of law into meaningful activity. Issam, if I can ask you to unmute yourself, and perhaps if I can ask you to try to give short answers to each of this, and then I'm going to turn to questions specific to all of you. So Issam, if you can start.
Thank you so much. I think the problem is not with the information. You Mr. Lynk rightly put it. It's not the to have access to what's going on. No one would claim that he or she did not know what happened in the occupied territories. I think there's sort of hypocrisy. There's sort of under many pretexts. For example, the last 3 decades have international law have been sacrificed with under the pretext of give peace a chance. I think we are in the era of the harvest of sins, where international law was intentionally not only put aside, but has been smashed by foots and by the way that power has been employed. And one could invoke here many examples. We are the Palestinians and the Israelis, by the way, we are further than any time to achieve the minimum requirements for justice or peace or security. And I think everyone has tolerated what's going on. No one wants to move a step forward, to reconsider the engagement with this part of the world. We have to be the victims of the Second World War, and everyone is happy with that. While, for example, Gaza, all the years long, has been transferred to be a humanitarian case. Definitely, the humanitarian crisis is very deep, but it's human-made. It's not an earthquake that hit Gaza. It's because of the system, the regime of a blockade that was imposed over Gaza. It's a collective punishment. How they reacted to this by sending more money. They love to play the role of the donor. No one wants to play any pressure to put an end for this. And for us Palestinians, to be honest, justice is a human act. And we accepted what civilized nation has accepted, and we refuse what they refuse. The ICC is just one example. The minute we approach the ICC, and the ICC is not an end by itself, by the way. As Nada rightly put it, the Israeli justice system, when it comes to the Palestinians, to the victims, no access, no way to pursue justice through the system. Then where to go? Imagine someone, his home was destroyed in 2008, and then when he reconstructed it, was again redestroyed in 2012, and the family member was killed in 2014, and then justice has not yet been achieved. No reparation whatsoever. No, so here we're talking the occupied territories are. The legal center is occupied, and the occupied power is not free hand to use whatever it think it's can use. There are civilized nations imposed very, very restrictions on the use of power and against civilians and their protected properties. So I think here is the problem. The problem now, it's a moment of truth. Either the international peace and security will dramatically jeopardized by this, what Israel is doing. And let me be frank and end with this. I think it's the moment where Israel should be liberated from itself. What Israel is doing is the prescription for self-destruction, keeping a whole nation 53 years. And by the way, history did not begin 11 days ago. History now for decades, aggression for decades. Those on the ground real offices, international organizations, I mean, representative offices, they know and they report back. When we are in Brussels, for example, the people there say, no, it's the capitals. The problem is the capitals. And when we are in the capitals, they say, it's it's Brussels. It's too much. And we fed up with this. And I think it's a moment of truth. Either to change this reality or the worst is yet to come. We said it a couple of months ago, the worst is yet to come. And we are in the eye of the storm. And we alarming the UK and its diplomats, foreign ministry. The worst definitely is coming. If Israel feels that it's immune, above the law, moral superior, and others provide legal and political cover, you are not doing any good for Israel by tolerating war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's the time to put an end for this. And I think it's time to protect civilians on either sides. Civilians should be protected. This is international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Issam. You remind me of what John Kennedy said in 1961. He said, he who makes peaceful reform impossible makes violent revolution inevitable. Hagit, I wonder if I can now turn to you with respect to that question, particularly in the context of settlements. As we've said, there's probably no greater international consensus than the fact that the Israeli settlements are profoundly illegal in international law, yet very little is done to be able to curb their existence, let alone their growth.
So I think the international law is only one tool to affect the world. We have political tools, we have public opinion issues, we have violence, unfortunately, also mobilizing people to do things, not always for a positive way, but law is only one way. And even in regular law, the very existence of a law system is not preventing the crime. So it's one tool. And also we should remember, only now do we get to a real investigation against Israel's occupation. So maybe it will give some fruits to this thing, to this occupation. I think we should use all the tools that are available. For instance, we are trying in Peace Now in Israel to affect public opinion and to try to persuade Israelis that we should end the occupation. And I think our biggest problem today is the despair. And it also goes to the international law, because I think people are so much despaired of our conflict and say, oh, it will never be resolved. And whenever I speak about the two-state solution, oh, it's dead already. And in Israeli discourse, the Palestinians will never agree. And the Palestinian discourse, the Israelis will never agree. And so why to even bother? And so people read the reports, they know what's happening, but they don't feel that there is any urgency to do something because it seems so hard and so dead. But at the same time, I think both sides are not, we're Israelis, we are the occupiers, but I think the majority of the Israelis don't want to be the occupiers. And although the settlers have so much power and support in Israel, majority of Israelis don't care about settlements, never visited the settlement, don't look at it at all. And I'm sure, but our problem is that we are trapped in the psychology of conflict, that it's us or them. And if they score points, we need to score back. And if it's bad for them, it must be good for us. And all this psychology, which is very, very hard to undo. But I'm sure that as soon as there is leadership in Israel that will say, okay, enough. We are out of the occupation. We're ending it. We're going to have a peace agreement with the Palestinians, etc. I'm sure the majority of Israelis will support it and will say, I was always against this occupation. This is why I'm still optimistic. The problem is, people say, we all, it's not that we don't see the light in the end of the tunnel. We don't see the tunnel. So I'm trying to keep the light on, and I hope that sometime, maybe soon, we will find ourselves in the tunnel.
Thank you for that. Sahar, I wonder if you can talk about the issue of the gap between international law and accountability with respect to the work you do with prisoners and with children?
I think the issue of prisoners reflects perfectly the hypocrisy in the international level when it comes for the political will and the political decisions of states to implement international law and to use this tool. Because I think when all the states in the UN agreed about these rules and standards in the international level, whether the Fourth Geneva Convention or all the international human rights treaties, they were really willing to make the world looks better. But when we see how they react when there's a case of a Palestinian prisoner and they they start to argue that this is terrorism. So for me, it's really very frustrating as a lawyer and a human rights defender that wants to seek accountability for torture, for arbitrary detention, for prisoners who dies out of health neglect and so on. So, but at the end of the day, I think also in the international level, it seems that there's no interest for the states to act because it's not affecting their directly, I mean, their interests in a way that pushes them to take decisions and to take steps, as it is not affecting the Israelis inside the state of Israel in a way that it caused them to go out against their own government to put an end for this occupation. Because I don't think that it's a problem of information, and neither the Israelis, neither the international community cannot claim that we don't know. They know. They don't want to act. And again, I think all what happened in the international arena after September 11th and all these arguments by the United States and the development of the war against terror, I think it undermined the discussion over the Palestinian cause and self-determination and mixed most of the international standards in relation to the right of people to go against colonialism and apartheid and to seek self-determination. And this is why they are tolerating, I mean, in the international level, this treatment with the prisoners, including with children, because they consider them as terrorist people and not people that they are fighting for their self-determination. Not all the 5,000 Palestinian prisoners that currently are sitting in the prisons are associated with serious activities that is affecting the security of the occupying forces in a way that it justifies arresting them and prosecuting them for international law violations. The majority of these prisoners are arrested because they were students active in the universities, human rights defenders, political leaders, civil society organizers, even workers in human rights organizations. All of the human rights organizations now are under attack and facing a smear campaign because of our legal work in order to seek accountability via the international tools that is available for the rest of the world in the international UN system.
Thank you, Sahar. Nada, if I can turn to you, accountability is actually your topic. How would you address the question of why is there such a large gap between the detailed and thick rights that international law guarantees, particularly in this conflict, and the lack of accountability and the prevalence of impunity?
Well, I think the problem is very much the Achilles heel of international law, which is the lack of enforcement mechanisms. For international law, or in international law, for it to be respected, states need to be willing to act in accordance with its words, to do as it says. And in relation to Palestine, Israel, unfortunately, there is unwillingness to step up and ensure that states and individuals responsible are held to account. Even at the International Criminal Court, it also depends on domestic mechanisms, domestic authorities to arrest and extradite individuals that have been indicted. And so the problem is quite crucial and quite large, and it relates to the way in which international functions, not only in relation to Palestine, but in the general, what international law is in the world's order today.
Okay, let me turn. I've got a range of questions specifically to each of you, and I've been asked several questions myself. But if I can start asking questions individually to some of you. Hagit, if I can start with you. There's a question one of the listeners has asked. They want you to explain the 1970 law, which allows Israeli Jews to be able to claim their pre-1948 properties, and they want you to explain it in the context of the 1950 law, the absentee property law, which forbids Palestinians who lost property in the 1948 war to be able to do the same.
Well, the law is not saying Jews are allowed, Palestinians are not allowed. We have more sophisticated ways to do it. In 1950, the definition was the properties that their owners are in enemy countries. Now, for instance, if you were owning a house in Jerusalem but living in America, like a Jewish American, you can continue to have possession of it. However, if you live in Syria or in Jordan or in any Arab country which were considered enemy countries, you are an absentee. This was the way it was defined. And in 1970, the law is only valid in East Jerusalem. It's a law that was meant to arrange a few issues of the newly annexed territory to Israel, which is East Jerusalem. And it says that properties that were under the control of the Jordanian custodian of enemy property will be released to the original owners. Now, only Jews had such properties. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem never lost their properties under the Jordanian time, and this is how it was done. So the discrimination is not said by words, but it's very, very clear.
Okay, thanks for that. Issam, if I can ask you a question that's been posed. Essentially what it is, if you can do it in a brief fashion, what are the current conditions in Gaza in the aftermath of this bloody violence, and what are the immediate humanitarian challenges facing Palestinians in Gaza? You've got to unmute yourself.
Well, as you know, Gaza is under a very severe, unprecedented blockade for 14 years in a row. It's unprecedented since 1967, with very serious dynamics on the different aspects of the daily life. And imagine in the situation now under this blockade, Gaza have witnessed 4 offensives. The recent one, which lasted for 11 days, I think the intention of the conduct of hostilities, the conduct of war, was very much intentional to inflict more destruction on the community. I think that was part of what so-called deterrence that Mr. Netanyahu was intended. I mean, next day when the ceasefire to be concluded, Gazans go to the streets to see the horror, see what the huge and large-scale destruction then they are shocked, and that's it, finito. It's very, very, very serious, and I think destruction was everywhere in the Gaza Strip. Again, Gaza, the number of people, 2.2 million, living in such very, very densely, the most overpopulated area on earth. Before the recent offensive, as I said, 85% of the people are dependent on humanitarian aid that is provided by many of the humanitarian agencies. Number of people were killed. I mean, we presented the figures, and 66 children. Families have been eliminated when they destroyed homes on top of those who were living in. So families have been just deleted from the civil registry. They are not anymore there. Babies, children, all I mean, the Al-Kolak family and Abu Auf family, 33 family members were killed just when someone decided to bombard very residential building in the heart of the very residential area in Gaza, in the Rimal area. Humanitarian situation is very deteriorating, very devastating, and today borders. I mean, the Israelis allowed the 4 bodies. I think yesterday, the 4 bodies of those who died in hospitals. Talking about patients who were transferred to Israeli and Jerusalem and West Bank hospitals, and then they were not allowed to return back to be buried in Gaza. But finally, we could succeed to have them in Gaza. Very severe restrictions on the movement. Electricity, as you know, is in with the destruction of the network, and the station is almost collapsing. Yesterday, we have some shipments of industrial diesel. We hope that the number of hours could be improved. Now it's only 2 to 3 hours per day in the whole Gaza Strip. Otherwise, blacked out everywhere. And you know, the already the system, the infrastructure is very deteriorating. I'm talking about the health system. So Gaza cannot cope with those numbers of casualties, injuries. It's too much beyond the capacity. And in the middle of combating COVID-19, again, has nothing to do with security. And one could here invoke many examples. And the situation is really very, very difficult, and destruction is everywhere. Streets and towers, multi-story buildings, and yeah, without alleviating the crisis immediately, I think it would be very catastrophic.
I can just ask a follow-up question to Issam. You've mentioned COVID-19, and I saw several pieces yesterday which talked about the fear that in the next several weeks there may be an even further spike in the spread of COVID-19, because so many people, at least 70,000, were gathering in very densely packed shelters, many without masks and in very close proximity to one another. And as we know, I think less than 2% of the population in Gaza has received even their first dose of a vaccine. Among the people you're dealing with, human rights defenders and health professionals, is this a fear that COVID-19, because of the war and the disruption with respect to the vaccination, but also what it meant in terms of people sheltering together, may wind up causing a further spike in COVID-19?
Indeed, there is a real fear, and it's really very risky at the moment due to the this huge destruction and the offenses over Gaza. Destruction was everywhere, including, by the way, the only lab for COVID-19 tests that has been attacked and I think have been dramatically jeopardized. I don't know to what extent has been refixed, but I think it's the only one in Gaza. It has been the Rimal clinic was hit and was affected by that. Now many thousands are in UNRWA schools. They flee their homes or their homes were destroyed, and they are just gathered in a very unhuman conditions. So there is real risk that it might spread the pandemic. And again, the vaccination from the early beginning, Israel doesn't feel that or feel that under obligation as an occupying power to furnish protected civilians with the needed vaccines. So Palestinian Gazans could buy it, and then you engage with the Israelis, negotiate whether they would allow them or not through, I don't know, WHO or other. So the situation is very, very serious before the offensive, and now it has been intensified, and there is real potential risk in this. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So here, if I can turn to you with one of the questions that has been posed, is the illegal administrative detentions that you've referred to, do they also extend to children? Are there children in administrative detention in Israeli prisons, either in the West Bank or in Israel itself?
As I said, Palestinian children under administrative detention, currently there's 4. And of course, in 2015 was the first time when Israel used administrative detention against children in East Jerusalem. They arrested 5 children then under administrative detention. I don't think it was used inside Israel against children. And inside Israel, so far, there's no one single administrative detainee currently. It could be used actually against Israelis, but it's restricted and it's really used in a very, very limited way. You would find like 1 person sometimes, and there's lots of years that there's no one. Although in these last weeks, the Prime Minister was threatening that maybe they should use administrative detention, but still they didn't use it so far. All the detainees that they were arrested from inside Israel, whether Arabs or Jews, were not subjected for administrative detention. Administrative detention could be used in the West Bank and East Jerusalem against everyone, like women, men, children, elderly, Palestinian Legislative Council members. Anyone could be subjected for administrative detention. Thanks
for that. Nada, if I can turn to you, one of the areas where you've developed an expertise on is at the International Criminal Court. And I think you've said before that international law is something to the effect of it's self-evident, but it's not self-enforcing. The only area, it seems right now, for judicial accountability for what's going on in the occupied territories are the various complaints at the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you can tell us what the chances are of those proceeding and where they are right now. And I wonder if you can also talk about whether or not you think there's a chance that what's gone on in the last month may be added to the files that are before the prosecutor.
Yes, sure. So the preliminary examination in the situation in Palestine was opened in 2015. And it took the Office of the Prosecutor close to 5 years to conclude her preliminary examination. The preliminary examination is a process in which the Office of the Prosecutor determines whether the office has jurisdiction, the court has jurisdiction over crimes, and whether or not certain acts amounted to crimes under the Rome Statute. Now, in 2019, the Office of the Prosecutor concluded that there was a reasonable basis to believe that crimes had been committed on the Palestinian territory, but that the prosecution office wanted to be certain that there were no jurisdictional barriers to the office to exercise their mandate. And so they asked for the views of the judges. And for more than a year, the issue as to whether or not the prosecutor may exercise jurisdiction, may open an investigation, let me put it that way, may open an investigation over the Palestinian territory was litigated. There were an unprecedented number of amicus, so-called friends of the court, that put forward their views on this matter. as well as around 1,000 victims, and of course, the Office of the Prosecutor and the State of Palestine. Now, the State of Israel could have engaged in this process, but chose not to do so directly. However, there were a number of organizations and leading figures that argued in favor of the court not having jurisdiction. We received this year the decision that really allows the prosecutor to proceed with an investigation confidently into crimes committed on the Palestinian territory. Now, the way the International Court functions is that it allows jurisdiction over a territory, regardless of the nationality of the individuals that committed the crime on that territory. So in this situation, both Palestinians and Israelis can be held to account. With respect to the recent escalation of violence, the prosecutor investigation goes back to 14 June 2014, if my memory serves me right, and there's no end date. So technically, the Office of the Prosecutor can stretch the investigation to cover recent events, and I believe it is important that it does so. I think it's very pertinent here to mention that the Office of the Prosecutor herself issued a statement when the escalation of violence was at its peak, and warned and reminded everyone that an investigation is opened and this matter is before her. I think it is crucial that the court not only addresses past crimes, but also looks at ongoing ones and future ones. And in doing so, really really applies the deterrent aspect of her mandate, because I believe that the International Criminal Court is not only there to punish, but also to prevent crimes from being committed. And it can only do so if it also looks forward.
Thank you for that. I have two questions that have been asked of me, and let me see if I can do this in an efficient way. One question asked, why has international law not been featured in the Middle East peace process? Is there a danger that the established universal rights will be eroded by preventing its use? And I certainly agree with the sentiment. Back in the summer of 1967, and this has become a familiar story for those who pay close attention to the Middle East conflict, shortly after the Six-Day War, shortly after the capture of the Sinai, the Golan, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, the legal advisor to the Foreign Affairs Minister, a well-known jurist, Theodore Meron, was asked to provide a legal opinion as to whether or not Israel could start building civilian settlements in these territories. And his advice was basically, you can, but you got to be very careful, and you're probably going to have to invent reasons because they skirt international law. And he said to the cabinet in his advice that Article 49, paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which I've mentioned to you before in my presentation, forbids the placement of civilian settlements by the occupying power in the occupied territory. So his advice was given. The advice when he said it was illegal was ignored. The advice when he said you have to look for other, perhaps more covert justifications, tended to be followed. And that, I think, is the stream right until today. It's the common thread that runs throughout. Israel has recognized that law is not on its side when it comes to annexation. It's not on its side when it comes to building the settlements. It's not on its side with respect to its refusal to apply the Fourth Geneva Convention. and in a range of other areas as well. So when Israel has been induced to engage in various peace processes, beginning with the Madrid-Oslo process in the early 1990s, it has argued, and persuasively to the United States, which has been the, I guess, overseer of virtually all of these peace processes, that the issues to be discussed must be done in a general way, and they must not be tied to international law. So there may be sometimes passing reference in any of these documents to Resolution 242 from November 1967, and perhaps to a few other general comments on law. But international law is not meant to be the centrality or the core framework of how these are to be done. If that was the case, then Israel could not negotiate over East Jerusalem. It could not negotiate over the Golan Heights or the settlements. It would have to admit under international law all of those actions were illegal, and would have to negotiate only on how quickly it should be ending the occupation, and that the new borders of Israel would go back to the pre-1967 lines. The fact that the United States allows Israel to be able to argue outside of the framework of international law, the fact that the US and to a lesser degree the international community allows all of these various agreements, interim agreements, to be done without direct and singular reference to international law, means in effect that the international community has been giving permission to Israel to wind up continuing with the occupation. The second question I was asked was, international law forbids the de jure annexation of occupied territory. De jure means the formal legal declaration, which is what the Trump plan was promising. But he goes on to say that Israel has de facto, in actuality, annexed large parts of the West Bank through settlements. How does international law apply in those cases? And it's very timely that you're asking this question, because we've been witnessing an extraordinary debate yesterday and today in the Irish Parliament, where there is a resolution before the Irish Parliament saying that de facto annexation has the same illegality in international law as de jure annexation. And this, in fact, has been agreed to by the Irish foreign minister. This is a major step among Western countries. Ireland is, to my knowledge, the very first country to say de facto annexation is annexation and as illegal as the de jure annexation. It's a point that I have made. It's a point that a number of human rights organizations have made over the last decade or so. And I'm pleased to see that a country like Ireland, which is consistently on many issues internationally, is punching above its weight, and now, of course, has a rotating seat on the Security Council, is beginning to articulate this both in the hallways of the United Nations and also in the hallways in Brussels as well. So let's hope that that spark being offered by Ireland is going to start finding its way into EU policy and into UN resolutions as well. It seems to me that this makes the most common of common sense, that if an acquisitive occupying power is actually laying facts on the ground to begin to try to make way for a future de jure annexation claim, it's going to start by creating these illegal facts on the ground, and that itself is illegal. So if we can begin to say, well, Israel didn't claim a de jure annexation in the summer of 2020 as it had promised to, therefore we can all sit and take a deep breath and relax. No, the fact that that there are 250 plus settlements with 480,000 Israeli settlers in the occupied territory means in itself that there's active annexation going on, and that this occupation now has become indistinguishable from annexation. We have roughly 10 minutes left in our session with respect to this, and let me just put a question which I'm going to invite any of you to want to address. The question is this: defenders of Israeli actions always cite security reasons for their actions, and they criticize those who talk about human rights and Israel's violation of international law as ignoring the security needs. How does a human rights approach deal with this? I'll invite any or all of you to address that. I'm going to go with Sahar because she's had the biggest smile on her face with respect to that. So do you want to go first, Sahar, and then I'll invite others to add to what your answer is.
Actually, this was the magic word that Israeli courts, especially the Israeli High Court, used for decades to justify the policies of the state violating the Palestinian rights in a legal manner, the security needs and the security arguments. I would just give an example of the torture case, actually, how the Israeli High Court famous decision of 1999 by Justice Aharon Barak was justifying that special techniques would be used against Palestinian prisoners, Palestinian detainees, torturing them in order to protect security under what so far was called the ticking bomb scenario. Although Israel signed and ratified the Convention Against Torture, it never was absolutely prohibited in the Israeli legal system. So by another way, actually, they legalized the use of torture in this way by using this term of security. So how you can, like, as a human rights organization, discuss this security need when we're talking about torture and ill treatment, that there's no justification in the international law that developed in the international level, not a war situation, not any kind of justification for the use of torture. Why we should accept the fact that the state of Israel is trying to justify torture under the pretense of their security, to protect their security.
Thank you, Sahar. Would someone else like to join in? It's Issam.
Yes, I think it's the security sometimes is the term is sometimes makes you laugh funny. If you go back to the military orders that were enacted since 1967 until very recently, when the Israelis redeployed from Gaza, there you could find orders that are very, very silly, very funny. It has nothing to do with security. Banning some books for Shakespeare, for example, or planting some crops, or the restrictions of the use of water. On it has very interference on the different aspects of the life of the people. Two things are important, and one of the examples, and in addition to what Sahar just mentioned, in one of the cases, we approached the High Court regarding a number of postgraduate students, female students, who want to pursue their study, postgraduate study at Mirzayt University. And they were denied. And coincidentally, one of the students whom we applied for was the director of one of the NGOs here in Gaza, and she has a permit on her capacity as a director of organization for some reason. And the court, the state, they could not claim that it's on the basis of security. At the beginning, they tried to say, no, it's security, and banning students to go to West Bank, from Gaza to West Bank, it's a security matter. Then they said it would undermine the our policy of separation between West Bank and Gaza Strip, as boldly as that. As boldly as that. So easily could invoke security, easily could invoke this strategy. And what also is very significant here, in addition to security doctrine, security pretext, is they're trying to all the time to delete the borderline between what's anti-Semitic and what's anti-occupation, and all are frightened. If you criticize Israel for its practices, or for example, the blockade, which is a collective punishment, very clear cut, very, very, very clear example of how the collective punishment is being inflicted on a whole community, in a whole nation. And if sometimes people criticize, easily security could be invoked. You have the ghost in your borders, Hamas, easily. So people have to suffer. Cancer patients should sometimes banned to pursue their treatment. While in Gaza, you cannot treat cancer patients. No single radiotherapy in Gaza, which is a must in case of cancer. So how come security here could be swallowed? It has nothing to do. It's more inflicting misery on the people. Many examples are there. And what's happening in Jerusalem, Gaza, the West Bank as well. Yeah.
I just want to say, if I may, that maybe one of the reasons that the security claim is so strong is that it's not really manipulative, at least not in the psychology of the occupiers. They're really feeling, Israelis really feel that all those measures, not to allow a sick person to pass through this street, but to that street, is really an essential security issue, and it's genuine. And I think psychologically, it gives it a lot of strength. But at the same time, I think we should not buy it. I mean, you cannot base everything about on security excuses and do whatever you want. And maybe this is another reason why nonviolent resistance could be very strong, because the excuse of security is becoming more and more or less powerful.
Nada, did you want to add?
Yeah, so I think we need to stop taking Israel's claim for security at face value. International law provides very clear tests for when a state or an actor involved in hostilities may carry out force, and in what way they may conduct their hostilities. In the beginning of my presentation, I spoke about the requirement, the cardinal principles of international law being the principles of precaution, distinction, for there to be a concrete military advantage to the bombing of civilians and civilian objects. We need to question the actions of Israel when it cries security. We need to test that claim against international law.
Thank you for that. And those have to be our closing words. I, first of all, want to thank all the many people who submitted questions for this panel. There were many more questions were submitted than could have been answered, which is sad in one way, we didn't have the time. But on the other hand, it shows the immense interest that the four of you have stirred up among our very large audience for answering a lot of very important questions. So if I can thank Issam Younis from the Mazin Center for Human Rights, Hagit Ofran from Settlement Watch Project of Israeli Peace Now, Sahar Francis from the Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, and Nada Kiswanson from The Hague, who's done so much valiant international criminal work on behalf of Al-Haq and other organizations. This has been a wonderful hour and a half with all of you, and the Balfour Project extends its extreme appreciation for the kind of insights you've all provided. And I'm now going to turn the gavel over to Andrew Whitley.